when we sit down and are ready to create our Android project, it's always very tempting to just get started right away. But there's a few questions you want to answer before you begin. They're not complicated questions, but you just want to know what the answers are. Now, the first thing to think about is your project name. And the first thing, what's in a name? How important is it? I'll just name my project anything. It's important to remember that, unlike in a case of like when you're building a project in .NET, where you're really just kind of creating a project and that name just applies to the project within Visual Studio, when you're dealing with Android, your name affects a number of different things. It affects how your classes get packaged up. It affects some things on how your app will actually appear in terms of its name in some of the application settings screens inside of Android. But probably most importantly, it also affects the way things appear inside of Google Play. And we'll talk more about Google Play later, but Google Play is the way people get to your application. And part of the naming that you set up within your project affects your identity inside of Google Play. And portions of that identity are really important for maintaining consistent updates or consistent user associations with your app as you update your app. We'll talk a lot more about that later. Now, another thing to think about is your application appearance. And so there's a few simple things you just want to know the answer to. One thing to think about is your launcher icon. Right? The launcher icon is that icon that shows in the start screen. Right? So that when someone goes to the launcher screen inside of Android, right, each app has its own icon. If they create a shortcut to your app on their main screens, that same icon shows up there. And the icon shows up in some other places as well that we'll talk about. So you want to make sure you have an idea what your icon is going to look like. And you want to think a little bit about the flow and the structure of your app. Do you want something very simple, just in terms of just a simple screen? Do you want to have a tab layout? Do you want to use one of the more sophisticated layouts where you actually have drop-down navigation where users can just click a section at the top of the screen, get a list of screens they can jump to? Right, so there's a lot of things to think about there. And as you're creating your project, Eclipse is going to ask you questions about what you think about or how you want to handle different portions of this stuff. Now, just because you set things up initially a certain way doesn't mean you can't change them later, but it's a lot easier if you know the answers to these questions when you start. Now, another important question is, what Android versions do you want to support? And there's a lot of issues around that, and behind that we need to understand. We'll talk a lot more about that later. We'll talk a bit more about it in the next module, and more about it as we go over time.